Taxation without representation. Welcome, class. So last time you heard me lecturing you, we were talking about the French-Indian War. Now we're going to talk about the aftermath of the French-Indian War as we get into the proper portion of the American Revolution. So, our first portion is going to be talking about taxes, about what it is, and what we're doing with taxes specifically is how much the British lay on the Americans in taxes that are going to cause so much resentment to the British Crown. So let's begin. So the first issue is the war debt. Britain owed hundreds of thousands of pounds in war debt, the equivalent of hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars today in war debt they owed to various creditors and banks. Now, in order to pay for this debt, Parliament instituted taxes on all British subjects to help pay for the war they just had. Now, these taxes are raised on the colonies, just as they're raised on all British subjects. To make life more difficult, they also enforce restrictions that had previously been ignored. So, remember we talked about salutary neglect, about how the British were just kind of leaving the colonies to fend for themselves. A big element of this is that the British were not enforcing various trade restrictions and tax collecting methods that were legally in place, but nothing was actually there in the field to do it. Now they're being enforced by the British Empire, and the colonies are chafing because they were accustomed to no taxes and little to no British oversight. And suddenly they have more taxes and more British oversight. So first things first, the Stamp Act was passed in 1764. It placed a tax on British stamps. Now, these stamps are important because they were used on all official documents. So, your marriage license, your death certificate, birth certificates, all types of data, license of this kind, had to have a royal stamp placed upon it. Even dice and playing cards. Like, you ever look at a pack of cards, and you'll always have a fancy design on the back of the card? Well, in the old days, that was actually a stamp. It was a British royal stamp. And you needed that stamp for any of these documents. Now, this was imposed to pay for the defense of the colonies. And part of this was the fact that the British also began a new policy where they wanted to institute a standing army in the colonies. And to help pay for that and for the previous expenses of the war, they instituted the Stamp Act. Now, there was so much resentment to the Stamp Act in the colonies that in 1766, 2 years after the act had been passed in 1764, Parliament repealed it. So they took it back. They removed it from law. However, the next month, they issued the Declaratory Act. And this is where Parliament asserted its right to make laws over the colonies. So one issue that had emerged was that during the debate over the Stamp Act, many people in the colonies had argued that Parliament did not have the right to institute taxes on the colonies without their own consent. And Parliament had argued that it had made such laws before, but at any rate, when they repealed the act, but to save face, they issued the Declaratory Act. So saying at this point, they're making it legally clear that Parliament is allowed to make laws to govern the colonies. So let's talk about the Sugar Act. The Sugar Act was not a new idea. It was meant to reform the 1733 Molasses Act, which was a tax on molasses coming out of the British sugar colonies in the West Indies. Now, the new Sugar Act decreased the tax charge but increased enforcement. So in one breath, normally you think it's good news. They're not charging them as much. But because they upped enforcement, it was now more difficult to smuggle molasses into the colonies. And as a result of this, colonists actually had to pay the tax. Now this decreased the profits on rum, which is distilled from molasses. And it hurt the New England merchant economy, which depended heavily on trading molasses with the West Indies. Generally, remember, they take molasses from the West Indies, and they would turn it into rum. And they would sell rum to the West Indies and to the rest of the colonies. And that hurt their business because now there was a tax placed on the molasses, which was a necessary ingredient. Wasn't now there was a new tax, but now there was a tax they actually had to pay. Now, in 1764, same year as the Stamp Act, Parliament passed the Currency Act. Now, this limited colonial capacity to issue paper money. It did not deny the colonies the right to issue paper money, but only under certain circumstances and with very specific rules. What this was designed to do was designed to force the colonies to pay their debt in gold or silver for any money they owed Britain or owed to British creditors. Whereas previously, the fear had been that they would simply print worthless or next to worthless colonial paper money and would then use that paper money to try to pay off their debts. This was put an attempt to put a stop to that. Now, the Quartering Act, passed in 1765. Now, the Quartering Act was then reinforced in 1774. Now, what this is that Britain wanted to put a standing army in North America. Now, Britain had previously not had a standing army in peacetime. So they wanted a full... Now, to us nowadays, it's rather odd for us to think about this being an issue, because nowadays in America, we have the world's largest standing army. And they're all over the country. But back then, it was very odd to keep a standing army in times of peace. You raised an army in times of war, and then you more or less dismantled your army during peacetime. But Britain wanted to keep a standing army, and keeping them in Britain was not going to be possible. British subjects in the past had balked very heavily at having to house British soldiers in their towns and in their houses. So much so that it had been one of the issues that plagued good old Charles I back during the English Civil War. And as a result of this, they decided that the new standing army would be mostly housed in the Americas. And they argued it was for the defense of the colonies. The colonies objected to this, as they argued that basically they didn't need to do any such act because there was no military threat. But, needless to say, Britain decided to do it anyway. Now, in the language of the law, it said that the soldiers would be housed in barracks and private houses at the expense of the colonies. So either barracks would be built to house the soldiers at the expense of the colonists, or these soldiers had to be housed and fed in people's private homes or businesses. So imagine suddenly one day the government says, oh, by the way, we have our army here. We're just going to have soldiers bunk in your house. And you're responsible not only for giving them a room and a bed and a place to stay, but you also got to feed them at your expense. So you got to pay to make sure they eat, etc. So colonists objected heavily to the Quartering Act. The other reason why they objected, this thing is hard to explain now. Nowadays, the army kind of has a very squeaky clean image. It's generally considered a very honorable profession, and men in that profession are considered very honorable. That was not always the perspective. A lot of times, especially in this time period, in the 18th century, people who joined a country's army, in many cases, some people who joined their navy or became sailors, and I discussed this a little bit when we talk about Columbus and his crew, were people trying to get away from stuff. Some of these guys were shady characters, trying to get away from life in their own hometowns, and many times escaping charges of various kinds. In many other cases, it was not unheard of for countries to give convicted criminals the choice of either serving in their army or doing jail time or taking other penalties. And so as a result, people often tended to look at the average soldier population with suspicion. And these were not always the kind of people that folks wanted to invite into their homes around their families. Now, the Townshend Act was passed in 1767. It was a tax on several essential goods, such as paper, glass, and tea. Now, in previous instances of taxes, the colonists, like in the Stamp Act cases, a lot of colonists tried to boycott goods that had the tax on it in protest against the British. But since these goods were fairly essential, colonists found themselves paying a tax. But it caused an immense amount of resistance, and many acts of violent resistance begin around the passing of the Townshend Acts. Eventually, in 1773, the Townshend Act is repealed, but is replaced by the Tea Act. So much ado about the Tea Act. The Tea Act was passed in 1773, and it removed taxes on tea that was sold by the British East India Trading Company. Now, the British East India Trading Company was a royally chartered company. So what that means is even though they were a company, they were a private company, they were given a special charter and special licenses by the British Crown. For example, the British East India Company was allowed to maintain their own paramilitary organization. So there were soldiers and sailors armed with the same kind of weapons or similar weapons to the ones the British Army and Navy used, but they were specific company soldiers employed by the British East India Trading Company. Now, the British East India Trading Company had a wealth of tea at their storehouses in London, but they were being outcompeted by tea from the Dutch East India Trading Company. And so they wanted to undercut the prices of smuggled tea, so Parliament gives them a special exemption. Their tea is not to be taxed and is sold through special consignment shops. Now, this undercut many of the smugglers in America who made a living smuggling in the cheaper Dutch tea. It also hurt businesses that didn't have this special consignment deal. They couldn't sell what was now the cheapest tea in the country. And this caused them to feel their business was being threatened. Now, this led to the Boston Tea Party. After the Boston Tea Party, we're going to talk about the intolerable acts that follow. Just for a little bit of a hint, the intolerable acts are acts that close the port of Boston, and it also includes the Quebec Act. And I'm going to explain a little more in person about why the Quebec Act was so detested by the colonists. But for now, I want you to focus on these acts, because these are the big ones. The intolerable acts are more of penalties than actual taxes. And they also include the 1774 revamping of the Quartering Act. The Quebec Act is not, strictly speaking, a tax, and is more of an act that the colonists object to on political and philosophical grounds. So we'll talk about that more in the next lesson. We also discuss colonial resistance and reactions to it. Thank you.